I'm on 45 driving north in Texas. I just left Houston earlier this morning after doing a couple sessions with one of my Apex clients, and now I got a couple more stops and I'm headed back to Pennsylvania. It's been quite a time on the road here, so it'll feel good to settle back in at home. But something that a lot of hunters and people in general deal with is hip, knee, and back pain, especially from overuse injuries. And it's something that we have to be careful with because of all of the rucking and things that we do, whether it's in training or whether it's packing in or packing out. It's something that we have to be careful of because, pun intended, a lot of people walk themselves right into it. And so I'm just going to talk about some things that you can do to avoid creating those problems for yourself. First of all, one of the biggest determinants of this, one of the biggest causes, is something I talked about in the last episode, and that's just not rucking too heavy, especially not too soon. A lot of people wait until the summer to really start getting their ruck training in, and then they feel like they have to catch up, and so they put a bunch of weight in their packs. Then it just beats the crap out of their hips, knees, and back. That's step number one. So don't do that. You need to progress your ruck training so that all of your joints, your muscles, everything adapt to carrying the load. And apart from carrying an appropriate weight, you have to make sure that weight's sitting in your pack right. I think taking the time to do that, and even, especially if you're out for 60, 90, 120 minutes, on a ruck or something, stopping to adjust your pack as the weight shifts. You have time to do that, and it's important that you do that because, first of all, it's what you would do in the field anyway, right? So you're not missing anything. But making sure that weight is sitting correctly is going to take a ton of stress off of all of those joints, right? Because let's say it starts to slip down on you, and it also starts to pull back. It starts to get away from your spine farther. First thing that's going to do is extend your spine. It's going to make your low back arch. And so there's undue stress on your back. But that being in that position also doesn't allow your hips to function as well as they should have, or should be able to. And so they're going to be doing more work than they need to, and they're going to be taking on more stress than they should. And that can start to cause problems in different parts of your hips, especially the outsides of your hips. And I know a lot of people get pain there. And then it's also going to make your quads have to fire harder. And so that's where people can start to get that pain on the front of their knees, like especially right at the top of their knee, right above their kneecap. So making sure that your weight is sitting properly in your pack and readjusting when you need to is super important. And then, the appropriate weight, like we talked about last time, progressing up. We start early in the year with about 15% of the body weight, and then progressively work up till we're doing most of our weight with about 20% of our body weight, and sometimes heavier. And then the cutoff for pretty much everybody for sustained hiking is somewhere between 25 and 30% of body weight, and you get above that and you start to see some real problems, especially because it changes your gait. And a weird change in gait is going to put stress on all of those joints that I just mentioned. So sticking in that range, and then the 25 to 30%, and if you want to generalize it, for most people the cutoff is going to be about 50 pounds. So progressing up with your rucking, staying in those weight ranges that we were talking about, and also keeping your pack weight dialed in the right spot on your back. I mean, another thing that's going to cause a lot of hip, knee, and back pain is just being too heavy. I'm not trying to be a jerk when I say this, but people carry extra body weight that they don't need, and that puts a ton of stress on your knees. And the one of the first things that working with clients over the years that helps them get out of knee pain is just losing weight. If you're carrying weight you don't need, if you're carrying fat you don't need, it's just extra stress on your knees. So that's a really big part of it. Another thing is just really moving well and taking time to do mobility training. We do it in all of our warm-ups. During different parts of different workouts, we'll build it in between sets of strength training, and we'll do it as part of a cool down. So doing a lot to make sure that your joints have full range of motion, are moving well, you have good control, good stability, all of that kind of stuff is going to be huge, because it allows you to maintain better posture, both while you're sitting still and while you're moving. And when you have your joints in good positions, the stress in your body distributes more evenly. So that means, you don't have one specific joint system taking the brunt of the load of what's going on. And that's where you start to see those overuse injuries, is because one joint is taking too much stress. I mean, you can look at it as an example with like pitchers, right? Like, they have typical problems. They have internal rotation issues with their lead leg because of slowing themselves down when they're throwing hard. And so they start to get essentially overuse issues in that hip and leg. And then obviously you're the shoulder from throwing so much. And so they have to do patterns that work in the opposite so that they don't develop these overuse injuries that result from all of that work. Now for us, we don't do anything quite so specific, but doing things opposite of what we might do are going to be huge. Like, that's why we do a lot of cat cows during our training, just to keep our spine moving, things like that. We do a lot of things like hip cars. We do things to create, which is just taking your hip through a full range of motion. And we do stability work, all of that kind of stuff to bolster against it, because the more access your body has to range of motion, the more ways it can solve movement problems. And so it can solve the same issue, the same movement, by taking different pathways, both neurologically and with your muscles. And that's really important, because the more options you have, the less likely you'll walk yourself into an overuse injury. So mobility is a huge part of it, moving really, really well. Another thing is something that people fail to do, and that's progressing your training and altering your training and the movement patterns and the way that you load them throughout the year. And so that's, you look at the early part of the year, and we do a lot more general training, right? So we're not just getting under our rucks, we're not just doing things for uphill and downhill movement. We're moving in different directions, we're doing different types of workouts, we're loading them in different ways so that we don't walk ourselves into some of these issues. So that's another thing, is just varying your training. Yes, we need to do, especially this time of year, I'm recording this on May 26th, so we need to do specific work to be ready for what we want to do during hunting season. But then, as we get into hunting season and later into hunting season, things need to get less specific so that we don't continue to just pound ourselves into the ground with super specific exercises that end up wearing down certain tissues and joints and things in our body. So movement variation and maintaining, your athleticism and stuff, by doing the mobility training we're talking about, and also just like things you might think of a sport team doing or something during a warm-up. Like for us, before every workout we do some movement skills, and it's marching, it's skipping, it's lateral shuffles, it's things like that, and just maintaining that base of being able to move in different directions and with different rhythms and things like that also plays a big role and helps out a ton. So varying your training, doing things to maintain and build your athleticism, moving in different directions, all of that is super huge for preventing overuse injuries in your hips, knees, and your back, your low back especially. And one other thing is making sure that you're doing movements that are right for your body. So just for example, some people are built really well to squat, and some people are built really well to deadlift, and it helps. We do both, but you have to find the variations that are right for you. So for example, with me, I have scoliosis, and I have a congenital fusion in my back. I was born with with two vertebrae fused together. And so if I try to back squat, I end up with really bad hip and low back issues just because my body doesn't have the range of motion to handle that well. Most people don't have the range of motion to handle back squatting all that well, so that's why I don't really program it. But and then you look at a deadlift where if you have a really long torso but really short arms, it's very difficult to do a conventional deadlift from the floor without putting too much stress into your low back. It's just the first thing that's going to break. That's where the stress is going to go, just because of where the fulcrum goes from trying to lift the weight. And so instead of it being in your hips, it moves up to your low back, and just that repetitive putting that stress on your low back starts to cause some big issues there, and that's where you start to see injuries. So simple things to do there is just elevate the bar, do rack pulls or elevate the weights onto some platforms or something, and working in things like sumo deadlifts, which move your femurs a little bit out of the way, because that will compensate for having short arms. But also just doing some mobility testing to find out where your range of motion limitations might be. So for example, if your hip mobility is poor and you're trying to deadlift from the floor and you don't have the range of motion or the control to do that, you're setting yourself up for a problem. If you have poor shoulder mobility and you're pressing overhead, you're setting yourself up for a problem, not only in your shoulders but also in your lower back, because if you don't have your range of motion to be able to get your arms overhead, as you press, your back is going to arch to try to find that range of motion. And so you have to set yourself up for success by doing the movements that fit your body as well as possible too. So, there's a squat variation that's going to fit you better. There's a deadlift variation that's going to fit you better. All of those kind of things are really important. And it's taking the time. I mean, obviously you can get assessed by me in Backcountry Ready or Pack Mule Elite. But, even just finding some kind of self-evaluation to be able to get a good idea of where your mobility is at a given time, so that you don't put yourself into bad positions while lifting and then repetitively do that and wear on the tissues and the joints that are just going to end up taking way too much stress. So if you can do those handful of things, you can do a really good job avoiding overuse issues. And like I said, that's setting your pack up correctly. It's not rucking with too much weight. It's making sure that you vary your training throughout the year from a movement standpoint. And it's, maintaining your mobility. And, I didn't mention ankle mobility, but it's super important in all this too, because if you have poor ankle mobility and then you try to ask your body to squat or lunge or do things that we would do in training or even in the mountains, especially your knees, are going to take more stress than they need to. So if your ankle mobility stinks, you really got to work on that too. One of the best things people can do for ankle mobility is honestly just walk around barefoot more often, because oftentimes the block is just they have weak feet, and when you have weak feet, your body just doesn't give the joint above it, your ankle, as much range of motion. And also making sure that your pelvis is sitting in a good position. A lot of people, especially dudes, walk around it with what would be called a hyperlordotic position, meaning that your low back arches just when you're at rest. And so that's also, gonna put some stress on your calves and make them tighter, because they're the last line of defense from keeping you from falling on your face. So making sure that those things are taken care of, but your ankle mobility is going to be huge, and just moving all of these joints, move them every day, and that's going to be huge. And you'd be incredibly surprised about how many hip issues and things go away when people just start walking more. I've seen it even, some of my clients, I have them buy a walking pad and just walk more during the work day. And all of a sudden, all these hip issues and things they were dealing with, they start to go away, because you just get back to using your gait normally and getting some blood flow, but also just, doing normal human stuff, and it helps a ton. But, and you also if you're carrying weight that you don't need to carry, losing weight needs to be a priority, because it just puts too much stress on all of those joints, you know. So you got to really calm that down and just make sure that you're not just arbitrarily doing strength movements. There are some strength movements that are right for some people and some that aren't. So you need to know how you're moving and whether or not you're maintaining good positions while you're lifting, and that's huge. And one of the big things is just stop back squatting. It's not necessary. You don't need it to get stronger. Front squat, Xerxer squat, goblet squat, you know, put the weight on the front side of your body to protect your spine, but also it increases your core strength just so much more than back squatting does. You know, if you really need to lift your strength ceiling, do that with a deadlift variation, whether it's hex bar deadlift or rack pulls or something like that. That will push your strength even more than a squat will to begin with, because you recruit more muscle. And then, you know, train your front squats, train your Xerxer squats, all of that kind of stuff for your specific uphill and downhill strength. And, you know, rotate things throughout the year. You know, don't just stick to the same thing all the time. Oh, well, you don't need a ton of variation. I think one of the things that people get themselves into trouble with is they program hop too much, and you need continuity to be able to continue to build your fitness. So like I said, ours goes through a rotation and we have more variation throughout the years, but it all lines up. One thing leads to the next, which leads to the next, which leads to the next, which is also super important, because if you're just doing random shit, fitness has to work in layers. Certain things have to happen before other things can be capitalized to the greatest degree, or that you have, you know, the capacity to be able to recover from other things. And if you don't have the capacity to recover and you just go repetitively do high intensity shit, you're going to beat the crap out of your body, and you're going to end up potentially with an overuse issue as well. But take care of your body, move, appropriate pack weight, use the strength exercises that make sense for your body, and just be smart about your training. I think another thing that we tend to do is just too much intensity all the time, and that amount of stress, especially when you're doing something repetitive, ends up in putting you in a bad situation. So those are the simple things that you can do to avoid overuse issues in your hip, knees, and back. So as always, I appreciate you listening. Thank you for that, or watching and listening. And I will be back next week with the How Should Hunters Train in June podcast, and I'll be laying out, you know, the start of our preseason training block and talking about what we're doing in phase 1. So thanks again for watching and listening, and I'll talk to you soon.